So, Alex, my first set of questions here are really, I just want to explore this idea of what makes a good private equity executive. And so, can you share with our listeners about your experience working with private equity firms and their portfolio companies and what you've learned about hiring for executive roles?
Yeah, absolutely. So, firstly, look, the private equity industry is absolutely jam-packed with incredibly intelligent individuals. The portfolio companies are full of incredible executives. But if there's one thing that I've learned, that having the job title of chief executive, CFO, COO, it does not mean that you're exceptional at what you do.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, for a lot of private equity executives out there, what one good executive's done at one company doesn't guarantee, as I'm sure you'll all realize, that they're going to be good at the next one. And unfortunately, there's plenty of paper executives, but they don't make exceptional leaders to come into businesses. So what I'd say around that, because it's easy for me to say that and then leave you all thinking, well, what do we do about it? The criteria here for avoiding such scenarios is the deep dive into what the actual need of the business is and the criteria of the executive. And in linking into what Jack said there about the golden nugget, the old if you stay till the end type process, I'll give you the actual process of how to deal with that and how to negate the issue that you will have of bringing executives in and them not being right. Royal Selection has an incredible reputation that since I founded the business back in 2017, we have a 100% retention rate on private equity C-suite executive appointments that we've completed since we started the business. Nobody has left the business within the first year. And that is the key critical success factor of an organization. That can you hold that? We've had multiple people leave in between the first year and the second year. But the only reason that's happened is because they've exited the business. They've sold, and obviously sold in those parts to a strategic and then moved on. So we do have a really good process that we follow, but that's very much it. There's really good executives in the market. There's some incredible people, certainly at private equity level, certainly at portfolio level, but just because you've got the job title doesn't mean you're exceptional at what you do.
Yeah. Well, Alex, I would say that's quite the proof in the pudding metric that your team has the 100% success rate within the first year with retention. I mean, in this world, that's pretty impressive.
We like to think so.
Yeah. So Alex, in general, one of the things, as I'd mentioned earlier, this conversation is highly relevant to our practice of ERP organizational change because, I think effective and efficient leadership is the key. And I really have spent a lot of time formally and informally studying leadership. But what do you think are some of the key skills and attributes that you believe are essential for success in a PE executive role? So, it's kind of a general question, but is there any rhyme or reason or maybe patterns is the better way to ask the question in terms of skills and attributes that you see in your most successful executives?
Yeah, so there's two elements that we've got here. We've got your private equity professionals, so your deal makers, your people in the business, and the people in the back office of the business. I don't like the term back office, but I haven't come up with a better option of that. And then obviously you've got your executives in your portfolio companies, which, being a private equity investor, they're probably the latter's where you find more of your challenges. What are the key skills and attributes that you believe are essential? And this is something I ask a lot on the podcast. And what's interestingly enough is I get lots on my own podcast that I run. What's interesting enough is I get lots of answers around hard work, motivated, self-driven. Like I have not seen a job specification written up by a recruiter or a business where they haven't asked for somebody who's self-motivated. And if every criteria of a business for hiring had self-motivated in there, then we'd probably have a lot less problems than we do with the churn and turnover of executives that we see both in private equity, and I know that happens in what I regard as the normal world, if that's the right term to group the rest. So this is a bit of $1 million question. The answer is, I'm going to give simple, but equally there's a lot of complexity to it, and we could spend probably the next 2 hours working this out. The problem is, if I gave you the key skills and attributes that will make an executive a success, you could also go, well, this person had it and they didn't make it successful for whatever reason. So one thing I always say is it depends on what you want and depends on what you need. Private equity firms, in my experience, are very good at deciding the type of executive they want but sometimes not always the executive that the business needs if we focus on the portfolio side. So it's getting a really clear picture of that. And again, that links into the kind of final pieces. I'll give you the process of how to run that. But one is them having the level of experience that you need in order to deliver the outcomes that you're looking for. And two, if I look at any executive that I speak to, the very difference between the motivation, hard work, driven, do whatever it takes, time mentality is simply that the executive has the desire to do whatever it takes to get the job done and get the job done well. And that seems to be the difference between a good executive and a bad executive is they have the experience that you require and that you need in order to deliver the outcomes of the business. And there's a lot of complexity in that. Just because they've worked at a competitor doesn't mean they've got that skill set. And secondly, is they have that desire. If you look at anybody who's a top performer in an organization, who has consistently outperformed themselves, and I don't mean got to the top and sat there, as a custard cream salesperson, for example, who's their best in the business because he knows everybody, but he's beating themselves year in, year out, is growing businesses, developing X, Y, and Z, is that desire to do whatever it takes to get the job done. And I mean that ethically, because I appreciate that could be taken from a negative connotation, but let's all assume we're all ethical business individuals and make sure that that job is done well. And those two factors are what I believe P firms need to look for when hiring executives: clarity on experience and what the business needs, not what you want, and then finding those individuals with the desire to do whatever it takes to get the job done and well.
Oh, well said. Thanks, Alex. Especially the part, what the business needs, not what you want. So being very clear on those needs, because it's all contextual, right? It's all based on context and what the business needs. Just because, as you mentioned, being a good leader in one organization may not translate to being a good leader in another organization necessarily. And like you said, I think having the skills and attributes is one thing, but transitioning or translating those to action is another thing, right? And then also context is a major factor. You know, this idea of motivation, hard work, desire, and getting the job done, I mean, that's not always an easy thing to measure. So let me ask you this, Alex. Based on that, then, how do you assess candidates for these roles? And what are some of your factors? What's some of the factors that you consider when making hiring decisions then based on your previous response?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's assume we have a really clear understanding of what the business needs and what the business requires, and therefore the outcomes that we're looking to get to. Mm-hmm. This is the sole reason why so many mistakes are made, is because those factors are not detailedly understood. And I will reiterate, that is a lot of mistakes made, even when you think you've got it right, is really reflecting on that. So providing we've got that, we're then looking at how do we assess the individuals. Believe it or not, my perception is the hard part is actually identifying a large number of individuals to therefore have an assessment process. So, for example, if you were looking to change ERP system, if you were only given one option as an ERP, that ERP system is going to look either probably pretty attractive against no ERP. So we need a plethora of individuals to assess at all at a similar level that have the right experience, etc. So there's nothing radical here with regards to how that assessment works. I'm sure everybody listening here has been through or led an interview process, and it's just about the detailed questioning and rigorous interview process that happens from there. So we just spend, I say all of our time, the majority of our time we are spent assessing that individual against the requirements that we have and the need that we have. Assessing each individual area, whether that be from they need to have grown business from this to this. Now, that seems quite a simple assessment to understand. We need to have grown EBITDA from this to this. And it's being able to going through the history of the individual and assessing against, we need this criteria for this, this, and this, and therefore we will measure the criteria of this candidate. And these are the outcomes we're looking for. Have they had these outcomes? Have they achieved what we want them to have achieved in what we want this business, we want them to achieve in this organization? And it's measuring against that. What I tend to find is a lot of recruiters tend to try and sell we've got a system that identifies top talent, and the amount of times even I was taught to sell that we work with the top 5%. And when I asked the question internally of how do we know if they're the top 5%, it said, well, no, it sounds good on a sales profile. If it was top 5%, and that top 5% could move from GE, I'm just going to use big corporates here, GE to I don't know, ExxonMobil, and grow that. If ExxonMobil still exists, I've no idea. Shell is probably a better example. Then that executive can just move to there and then make it successful. But chances are that wouldn't work because GE is a different business to an oil producer, and going through there. So the criteria here depends on that assessment process for what you're then going to question and fire through in order for that person to be assessed correctly. So when I can't answer the question by going through and telling you here's all the criteria, because it depends on what you're looking for. But to help here and give some level of guidance, most portfolio companies want to do X to Y. Most portfolio companies want to achieve a revenue, an EBITDA number in the future, and then we look at that. So have we got a person that's achieved and done that? Yes. Can we back that up through research of, is this person telling us the truth? Did that business go through that exit? There's then the detailed process of how involved in the process was that person. Like the amount of chief executives or CFOs that we've interviewed, just because they're the two most commonly replaced positions, that have been passengers in processes of exit, that have been there but didn't actually do the process. The private equity firm did it. So you've got to go into the detail here of, was it them that achieved it, or was it the private equity firm that did it, or was it actually the chief executive and they were passengers, learned from the process, and they've done that 3 times in their career. So the key criteria questions in the assessment comes from, what are you looking to do, without going through tons of questions which may or may not be relevant, but then it's then diving in. So if you think about the key criteria you want to do for your portfolio company right now, look at the outcomes you're looking to do, measure the candidate up against that if you're doing it, or just use an executive search firm to do it. But of course I'd say that. Then literally go into detail on, did they run the process? Did you meet with the investment bankers on the exit process? Did you do this? What challenges did you come through? And then break that down into granular detail based on what you're looking for them to achieve. And don't just look at the top line outcomes with regards to the assessment of the candidate. Look into the potential challenges. One of the key areas that we regularly see from a CFO perspective is ERP implementation. That nicely fits into to what you guys do there. But if you're going to need that change on an ERP basis, has the profile done that? Have they worked with the ERP system that you may want to use in order to implement that? Have they done it in a similar environment? It might be that they don't have that, but they've got everything else. And therefore you might need to outsource that and bring that in. But the challenge comes when you miss too many of those gaps, and therefore it just ends up causing problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Great insight there. And, we've seen cases, over and over where we've seen leaders that are very charismatic and they've had some success at a previous portco, but then in their next role, they've lasted 6 months. I could provide several examples on that. And it's just to all the points that you're making. There's a lot of things to really look at and understand to make sure that they're the right fit in that context for that organization. And I think that's a significant piece of the puzzle that private equity firms need to understand. But what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that PE firms face when they're hiring executives, and how do you help them overcome those challenges? And I think through your answers to the previous questions, I think you've covered some of that. But, in general, as a PE firm, what's their biggest challenges, and why do they go to Alex in your company to begin with?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is that understanding piece. So it's a bit of reiteration there, but actually understanding the criteria of what you need.
Yeah.
I think, again, I'd challenge any private equity executive as, when did you last get trained in interviewing people? I challenge any private equity executive, and I don't mean to be confrontational here, but nor am I saying that we're experts and we do X, Y, and Z and, oh God, we know everything. That's absolutely not. I'm not going to start sitting down and saying I know more about an LBO than anybody else. But what I'd say is just that challenging the thinking around what is the criteria of what's needed in the business in order to achieve. There's too many mistakes made in private equity through hiring the wrong executives. And I know this because we clean up, okay? We have to come in because there's been an executive that's been brought in. And fundamentally, it's because we haven't understood. Now, I put the recruitment firm with that as well. We haven't clearly understood exactly what the business needs in order to go through its process to do a completion and and do a liquidity event. So that'd be the first thing, is understanding that. What are the outcomes? What do we want to achieve? And what are the challenges that we'll face? And break into that. And I know we're going to talk about culture later. So there's also that element to be challenged on there. The other, I suppose the other area that I see as a big challenge is a lot of these mistakes are made is also going out as lower middle market and hitting the SREC firms. Now, of course, I'm going to challenge any thinking with regards to who you're working with and what you're doing, but I'm not saying, you have to work with raw selection. Oh, yeah, we're the best. We can do X, Y, and Z. It's not my positioning. My positioning is working with the right executive search firm that can support you and your firm. If your name isn't Warburg Pincus, Carlyle Group, I'd challenge maybe that thinking. If you're having issues, if you're working with a firm and they're nailing it, it doesn't have to be Shrek. And Strex fans is all the initials of the big executive search firms, for anybody wondering why I'm quoting a cartoon. Then it's about thinking, well, why is that not working out? Now, the reason I mentioned Shrek is because Shrek like working with Warburg Pincus Carlyle Group, because their salaries can be obviously extenuated both in the private equity firm but also in the portfolio. Mm-hmm. So it's about making sure that you're identifying the right talent and bringing the right individuals in, but also making sure you're working with the right firm that's going to invest time, energy, and resources into any type of process. Because the reason that I say that is because the amount of searches that we see, either executives are brought in incorrectly and they're not the right person, or secondly, which can be a mistake of the private equity firm, mistake of the executive search firm, both in most occasions. And then secondly is not being able to actually complete on a search, which is too regularly an occurrence. There's a very large executive search, private equity firm that I spoke to that's got less than a 32% conversion rate on searches.
Wow.
And I'm just like, well, that's just madness. So identifying the right talent is very simple. It is data of the people in the right organizations, in the right type of businesses, and then approaches. It's a bit like sales. So all you're looking for is to be able to identify the right people and then approach them en masse. And it's about working with the right firm that works in your space. I can't remember which book I read that defines that quite well, but what they said, in paraphrasing, but never work with a firm where you're the biggest. Never work with a firm where you're the smallest. You want to work with a firm where you are above medium, so you're highly valued, but you're not the largest, because it probably means that they're probably not able to accommodate for you. But equally, you don't want to be the PE firm that's working with a big executive search firm and you're not getting the level of service. I reiterate, if you're getting it, don't move, don't change, stick with what you're doing. But that level of service isn't as good because they're chasing the bigger bucks and you're actually the small fish, and therefore you're getting passed to, no disrespect to juniors in a firm, but you're getting passed to people who probably don't have the level of expertise and experience, and the partners probably out for dinner with somebody of more value. So that's a few challenges in there. I apologize. That's a little bit of a burning point for me because I'm sick of, it's great because we get approached all the time from private equity firms now wanting to solve the problem. But just that level of working with the right firm and due diligence beforehand just saves you the mistake of hiring the wrong person, but also secondly, not getting anybody in the first place and having a gap for ages.